Okay, I am going to show you how I draw flowers in ink and watercolor, like the kind you've seen on my social media accounts. We're going to start with a poppy today because I really like the shape of these flowers. And even though I don't have a real one here for reference, I think I'm going to go ahead and draw from this Pinterest image. It just gives me an idea of what it looks like. So to show you some of the tools I use, I have a mechanical pencil. I've got a lot of mechanical pencils and I feel like they're all pretty much the same. You don't want one with a too thick of a lead. Over here I also have some water that I use for watercolors, and you can see there all my watercolor paints, and a micron pen which is waterproof, so when you use that to draw with you can easily watercolor over it. This one is a 0.02 size, and they come in all sizes from very fine to pretty thick, even brush type pens. So let's look at the poppy again. So I'm going to just do a simple sketch first of how I want it to be on the page. I want the flower up here-ish, and thinking of it as kind of a bowl shape because that's what it looks like in the picture. Again, it doesn't have to be perfect. And then thinking of this as a bowl, you can see this would be the upper rim of the bowl. I then want to kind of draw a straight line through what would be the middle of it, because one thing about flowers is the stem's always attached to the center of the flower, with I suppose some exceptions. So let's go ahead and start. I'll show you that reference picture one more time. Now bear in mind that we're not trying to exactly duplicate it, we're just gonna make it look pretty. Okay, there, so I've sketched in the basic poppy, and I think I'm going to go ahead and put some of that other stuff that's in the background in here as well. This is going to be a pre-opened poppy, a flower bud. You can kind of see one in the picture right there, and it is, they just sort of hang down here. They are all about the same. I'm pretty much going to draw this one from memory because I've seen so many of these, and because I do like to draw poppies so much. So we'll put him there. And over here, let's have it coming through here. Maybe a seed pod, because this is something else that you see a lot of. And these are pretty cool little shape. They have a little sort of a crown shape on top. So that's a good start. Now it's kind of a plain picture, so I think I'm going to put a leaf in here as well. Now again, for this one I would normally use a reference picture, but this again being a plant that I've drawn a lot, I think I can go ahead and draw it by memory. So let's see how that goes. Okay, now I don't know how realistic this is to an actual poppy, but I think it's going to be close enough for what I want to do. And as long as I like it, that's all that matters. Notice that I'm kind of being pretty rough with the lines here because I really don't. It's nice about drawing flowers, you really don't have any set in stone way to draw the thing. It's really just a matter of what do you like? Is it interesting? Basically, does it make people happy? Or does it make you happy? So I'm going to go ahead and start inking it in now. Again, I'm using this fine micron pen. I really like these, and you can get a lot of fun little details. As I draw, I'm still going to be looking at my reference picture because that's where I'm going to try and sort of get the feeling of all the little shapes and wrinkles in the leaves. And as you can see, I didn't totally draw in the little stamen or whatever they're called around the middle of the poppy because I can see them in the picture, and I'm just going to go ahead and add those in as I draw. It's too much to draw in pencil, I think. So let's go ahead and do the ink. Okay, so as you could see, as I was drawing, I wasn't always following the pencil lines, and that's just because as I'm drawing, I'm thinking, well, try and make it a little more fancy, a little more real, or just more interesting. I'm drawing now the little hairs on the poppy stem, and the hardest part for me is getting those two parallel lines of the stems of the poppy, because man, it's hard to draw even one straight line, yes, for most people. And then drawing two of them that are parallel is hard. As you can see, it's not always perfect, but you know what? That's okay. The one thing that I learned, the trick that's kind of helpful for me, is if you're drawing a long line, it's okay to stop and leave a gap like that once in a while, because people will see it as a continuous line. They're not going to be like, oh, well, that stops there. Your eye will fill in the gap there. So it's easier to continue on with a long line that you want to go a certain way if you actually stop, pick up your pen, just go ahead and move it down a little bit, and then continue onward. It's better than drawing an overlapping line, because then you get that thick area where the lines overlap, and then it looks a little awkward. So here's the leaf. And if you've seen a poppy leaf, you might be thinking, well, that doesn't 100% look like a real poppy leaf. And you know, it kind of doesn't, but it kind of does. It kind of looks like the flame job on a car, but you know, again, it's going to be fine. Don't be too fussy, man, especially when it comes to drawing flowers, because they can be really beautiful and they're not very demanding of your skills, I think, and I think that's why I like to draw them so much. Those and insects, it's like nobody knows when you draw an insect wrong. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to let this sit for a minute so the ink can fully dry, and then I'm going to erase it. And this eraser that I have here is a Faber-Castell. I've tried a bazillion kinds of erasers. One of them is this little kneaded eraser, which is pretty cool if you just like work with it. It's like almost like gum, and then you can use it to erase. But then over time they get kind of thick, and they get all the graphite embedded in them, and you're supposed to throw them away, but I never do. So I read about this one on a watercolor group, and I really like it. It folds together, so it's like a little switchblade eraser. It's great. So now I'm just going to go through and just erase all the pencil marks. Super easy. Here we go. Okay, quite a mess. So what I like to do is I have this big fat brush here. It's probably meant to be an acrylic or watercolor brush, but I only use it for this one thing, and that is getting all the eraser marks or all the eraser dust off the page, because man, stuff is everywhere. I don't know if they make a dustless eraser, but wouldn't that be cool? All right, so then I'll just check it out. Now the thing about watercolor is that if you watercolor over pencil, it's really hard to erase. You can't really erase once you've watercolored over it. So I try and be pretty thorough about catching all of the places where I've used pencil. So then I can see it a little better, and now I can maybe go in and add some stuff. I'm gonna make the main leaf vein here a little thicker, and I don't know, just kind of sketch it in. Maybe add a little more. I don't do too much shading in pen because I really want the watercolor to do all that work, but I've seen some really beautiful elaborate pen drawings where the people have done all the work with pen and then just added a watercolor sort of wash on top, and man, that's beautiful stuff. But in this case, for this particular style, I like to just go ahead and do it in the watercolor. All right, so we're just about ready to start with the watercolors. Here are some of the colors that I like to use. Now some of these are pre-mixed, some are not. I have a lot of watercolors over here, as I showed you. I tend to use a lot of greens for leaves and things, so of course I've got some of those pre-mixed, and then actually over in my big watercolor tray here I've got more greens, I've got some purples, I've got this fun palette which has a lot of purples and blues and a lot of interesting kinds of grays in it. So we will probably use just a few of these. I'm kind of going to make this one up as I go because, again, I've done a lot of poppies and so I know already sort of how they're supposed to look. All right, so this brush that I'm using is just sort of a medium weight. My water over there is fairly clean. And the color that I have here, I don't want to dictate too much about color, but this right here is one that's just mainly red, and I've got a purple, here, and I like to just mix it in together for this sort of poppy color. Poppies can be a million different colors, so as you can see here, I'm going to put this over here. There we go. I got a little red. I'm just testing this out on a piece of scratch paper that I have. So I've got red here, got purple here. So make sure you can see that. I'm just kind of going back and forth, mixing them together. That's pretty good. I'm going to go lean a little harder on the red because the original was pretty red. That looks pretty good. Maybe even let's add some yellow to make it more orange, and I'm gonna dip into a yellow that I have off camera there. That's really pretty. So I'm just mixing in some yellow in there too, and it's good to mix a pretty good amount because you don't want to run out of the color halfway through and then have to go back and figure out, oh, what did I use? So I'll put this up here, and we'll start with the poppy itself. I'm just getting some water on my brush, and it doesn't matter if it's still got some of that color in it. I'm just going to lay it down and do like sort of a first overlay for the lightest shades of this guy. The ink will have dried by now. It's important to make sure that ink is dry before you start, because even though that is a waterproof pen, you don't want to get smearing the ink when it's still brand new on the paper. So there we go. Just laying down a very thin layer of color here. I just picked up a little more on my brush, putting it in here. The colors in the reference photo, I'll show you again. If you notice, they're deeper in the shadows and deeper towards the middle of the flower. So it's okay if I get some of that in the middle. Okay, now while it's still a little wet, I'm going to mix up a little bit darker color here. I'm using the red, and I'm using some of this purple, this dark purple, and I'm going to test that out on my sheet over here, and then I'm going to go ahead and start adding that in. And notice how when I do, because the paint from before is still a little bit wet, it sort of spreads out a little bit and sort of mixes with the other colors that are already down there. And if I find that I've put too much on, I can just dry off my brush. I've got a piece of tissue over here, dry it off a little bit, and then I can pick up some of it, move it around a little, and I just want that real rich red. I'm not worried too much about keeping it in the lines at any given time here because, I mean, hey, it's a flower, right? So it's pretty abstract to start with. I know that I've gone over the lines in some cases. I don't care. It's a painting. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's not a photograph. So I'm just going to keep putting that in. I like the reds of the poppies a lot. I'm kind of trying to draw the paint along the ink lines that I drew because it does kind of go into the shadow areas and kind of makes for shadows. But again, at this point, we're still just laying down some basic colors here. It's not super rich. I'm thinking I'm going to add a little yellow back into the mix here. Let's see. Yeah, you can see I just added a little yellow to my brush, and it comes in with this more orange color. Again, it's totally not the same as the reference, but it's a pretty look. I'm just about the pretty flowers. ask my husband. That's what I talk about a lot. All right, so now I'm kind of just playing. I'm adding in more yellows because, again, this is in the sunlight, so you're going to see a lot of yellow in it anyway. And those top highlights where the sun comes down, they're going to be pretty yellow. That's interesting. All right. I'm going to let that dry a little bit, and while it's drying, I'm going to bring out the green, which I have over here on a separate palette. So I know that the color of a poppy's leaves is going to be a little bit of a bluish green. So I've got a little bit of green on another palette that I'm bringing in. And I've got some already on this palette. And I don't know if you're supposed to mix greens together, but I sort of do anyway because I just want what I want. I want a certain look, right? So I'm picking up a bluish green here. I'm going to bring my little test piece of paper over here so you can see. This is the thing I've been using to test all my colors. And this is what I'm getting. So I'm mixing a sort of bluish green with a more greenish green, if that makes sense. A green that's more based on yellow, because I want something kind of in between. And it's probably kind of boring because green is green, right? So if you want to fast forward through this part, I don't blame you. But anyways, there we go. I've got a pretty good mix. I'm gonna go with that. And I'm gonna start with the big leaf there. Let's put the paint here so you can see it. I'm going to start with this big leaf, and again I've got lots more water than paint on my brush to start with. I just dipped it in the water, got a little bit of paint on the brush, and I'm just sort of filling it in. It's like a coloring book, right? I'm just sort of adding color through this whole leaf. Okay, there's the leaf. So now I'm going to go in and add the thinner areas, the stems. Same color, basically, same technique, where I'm just going to get a little bit of green, a little bit of water on my brush, and just get a little bit of the green in here. And now I have a thinner brush. It's not that kind of, it's like an 1/8 inch brush, but this one's quite a bit thinner, so it'll be easier to draw in these stems. And again, just like with everything else, I don't care if I go over a little bit. It's not a big deal. Just a little more green there. Yep, and I did go over. Kind of just got used to that. It's still pretty. So just drawing in those little thin stems. Oops, I just put my hand in here, but that's okay. You do have to have kind of a steady hand, but you get used to it. I'm adding in the green for the bud, and we'll do some, I'm going to wait for that seed pod because I know the seed pods are kind of a slightly different color. They kind of got a little red in them. They're a little more brownish. So let's just do this for now. And then let's come back here. So here on my palette, you see I also have reds with the greens, and that's because a red plus a green makes sort of a nice greenish brown. See that I'm mixing there? So I'm going to use that. I'm getting a little more water on my brush to thin it way out. And then I'm going to use that on this bud because, like I say, I know that their color is not quite as green. It's just a little bit of that brown. There we go. So that's a first layer on all those guys. Looking pretty good. So I think now I'm going to go back to the flower. Okay, so now I'm over here with my palette mixing up some new color for this. And what you're going to see here is I got some of the red, some of this red, and I got some of this purple, and I put them in a third well in the palette, and it's going to make this really rich sort of purplish red that this time I'm not going to use a lot of extra water on my brush because I want this to really be very, very deep and intense. And I'm going to go back to the flower with that more intense color. And looking again at the reference photo, you can see some of these areas here where they're kind of in shadow, or the leaves are the petals are a little textured. And that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to put that in with this newer color. Now I might occasionally get a little water on my brush just to let that paint spread out. Meanwhile, the green is all drying. And what I'm doing in between, when you see my hand go out of the frame, is I'm getting a little water on the brush, and then I'm usually tapping it on this piece of tissue, this kind of now gross piece of tissue that's in my hand, and just getting too much water off it, so there's not too much. So there we go. That is a lovely, lovely red. And I like how when I put the color on top of the already wet part of the painting, it spreads like that. Yep. So again, I'm kind of trying to follow what I see on the reference image, but I'm not being too particular. I'm just doing what I like. It's nice to kind of keep in mind the shapes of these folds in the leaf, because you do have a certain amount of shadows that are going to be in there. You can look at the reference. You can just sort of think about it in 3 dimensions. Like once you get used to drawing and painting pictures of real life stuff, you sort of start to see, you know, the light's coming from one way, so the shadows will fall on the other side of that. If you're used to painting, you kind of know what I mean. There we go. And then again, the deeper in the petals of the flower you are, the richer and more intense that color is going to be. And the stuff that's closer to the top of the flower is going to be more in the light, so it will be less shaded and less bright. Kind of like that. And then some things are in the middle. So I'm going to take some of this darker color, wetting the brush again. Take the darker color and pull it up into the lighter area. Just some plain water does that. I kind of like having soft edges on these shadows and stuff, although in reality, honestly, shadows usually have pretty hard edges, especially shadows in sunlight, which, I mean, most flowers are, right? You get a picture of them, or you take a picture of them and they're in sunlight. But I like the look of the soft edge, so I do what I like. There's also a place in the reference image where the petals overlap, and so it's a little thicker. They're like very thin tissue, and it's a little thicker there. So I'm going to try and simulate that here in the middle. And less light gets through where they overlap. Although it's still a pretty light color. Now I'm going back in the petal, underneath, leave the top a little lighter. Same here, go underneath, leave the top a little lighter, because it's up in the sun. As long as that area is still wet, I can come back in with a little more color and drop more in. So it has that cool sort of spreading effect. Add a little more down here. It's always somehow the darkest at that very bottom part of the poppy. That's looking kind of nice, huh? I like this one because of the yellows I added in it. That's something I don't always do, but I thought, let's try something different. And you can see I'm kind of trying to draw the shapes of the folds a little bit. And you know, if you want, you can always go back in later and re-ink it so you can see more texture that way. No rules there, right? You can do whatever you want. Again, adding a little shadow where it goes down into the flower, because that one's coming up from the bottom. Adding a little rich color in there and let it spread up. It's interesting. I like it. Okay, now I'm going to go back to the leaves and do a second layer. They're still a little wet. That's okay. And I'm going to again use this this pretty rich green, and again diluting it with less water. So I'm adding some color to it, and I've got a test page over to the side that you can't see. So I'm going to grab some of that green. And again, I'm going to try and remember where the light is coming from. In my mind, light always comes from the top left of the page. And the reason for that is because I studied scientific illustration, which is where I learned a lot of how to paint stuff like this. And in that field, for whatever reason, light always comes from the top left. It's just sort of a thing, interestingly. So thinking about that, I'm thinking that the light is coming from up here, and the ridge of this leaf in the center is keeping the area shaded that I'm painting now, so it's going to be obviously a little bit darker than the other stuff. So I'm painting that a little darker green. And you can totally just go back and forth with layers and layers and layers. Obviously, that's kind of what I do. You can do it as long as you want. After a while, it does start to get a little overworked looking, and that's really easy to do, and I do it all the time. It's just like, stop. You know, you just have to stop at some point and be like, okay, this is good enough. I can live with this. And sometimes I can't, and sometimes I hate it, and then I'll sort of walk away, and then I'll feel crappy about it for a while, and then I'll come back and, oh, maybe it's not that bad. I'm sure you know what I mean. So if you see here, I'm leaving some light spaces where these additional ridges of the veins are kind of sticking up. So again, it gives a little more dimension. I'm going to go on the other side and thinking of that light coming from above, at least, maybe if not necessarily top left. I'm going to go in and show where there's a little dimension in there. You could be pretty scientifically specific with this if you wanted to. You could really think about, you know, what each of these leaf veins is doing. What's the correct lighting position? What's the correct shading? Or better yet, draw it from a real leaf that you have in front of you. And that's a really good thing to do. It's really important to be able to draw from life. And barring that, maybe draw it from a photograph where you can see all the details. What I'm trying to do here, though, is not necessarily to recreate reality, as I've said all over and over. I'm just trying to do something that's interesting and that I like. And oops, you get a little paint there, and sometimes you just push it around with your finger and it goes away. Secrets of watercolor. So yeah, like you just kind of do what you feel like. And it took me a long time to get to that point, because coming from a scientific illustration background, you're like, oh my god, it has to be 100% perfect. It has to look exactly like the thing. And that's fun and challenging and impressive when people can do it, but I am not there. So I'm sure this video is going to be boring. This is the first one of these I've ever done, but I will put it out there and see what people think. Okay, it's a lot of interesting colors there, a lot of interesting greens. I'm going to take that same dark green. I'm actually adding a little more green to it because I'm going to now go and show some shadows on these stems here. And man, talk about a steady hand. You gotta really hold on to it. So I'm putting the shadow on the right side because of my top left thing. I'm gonna add a little shading on this guy, picking up some of that greenish brown. Again, this tiny brush is good for that. It's not super tiny. If you wanted to get really good detail, you could get a much finer brush than what I'm using, but I've kind of narrowed down what I like to 2 or 3 brushes. So there's that. While I'm doing this, I'm kind of glancing up at the flower and wondering if it's done. I think it might be. Put a little bit of the darker color in there. Again, letting it bleed all together, even just in that little stem area, looks nice. Now this guy, he's round, so just adding the roundness to it. And notice I'm just leaving some of those lighter areas unrecolored, unretouched, because that's where the light's shining, up here. And that gives it a lot of dimension. I really like the roundness of it. Put more in there. Go back in. This stem is not as accurate and perfect as I would have liked. Let's get that going down there. All right, and one more thing I haven't done yet, and that's this part right here. That in the reference is real dark. It's not black, but it's a pretty dark color. So I'm gonna go over here and get some of this like dark olive green that I have. And I'm going to even add some red into that to make a pretty dark greenish color. And I'm not sure how dry this is, so I'm just going to dip it on here real lightly, see what happens. Whoops, oh, good thing we can fix that real fast. There we go. That was a bit too much color on my brush. It fell on the painting, but I'm fast with my tissue over here, so there we go. Put that dark green in there. That's the thing that becomes this later. And it's not bleeding into the red, even though if it did, I wouldn't be too upset because that is a pretty dark area in the flower. I sometimes even go back with like a dark gray and add shadows in. I may do that on this one too. But it still has some light on top of it. At least in my version it does, because I want it to stand out a little bit. I want to see that thing in there. And for somebody who did scientific illustration, I'm not very good with the names, obviously, of these parts of the plants. Interesting. Okay, so I decided to do a little more touch up on the top flowers, so I'm taking some more of this red, and I'm actually adding some of this blue into it. It's like a dark bluish gray, and this is going to be a real dark purplish red, but that's okay because I want to really pop some of the shadows here. It's gonna give it a little more dimension, I think, and that's good, and a little more color. And just contrast, I think, I don't know too much about stuff, but what I have noticed is that things that have a lot of contrast, it almost doesn't matter what color they are. You can draw something like this in green and yellow, and the whole thing in 2 colors, and as long as it's got a lot of contrast, people like it. It looks good. There's something about that. Boring paintings don't have contrast, I guess, is what I'm trying to say. I don't know. So I'm just going in, again, the shadowing in the deepest areas where it's down in that cup of the flower. And then I'm just blending it a little bit. And I just take some plain water and blend it up. Same there. Doing those ridges. I'm trying not to get too much paint on my brush at this point because I don't want it to be overdone. I just want it to be delicate strokes. So I got to be pretty careful each time. I either dab it off a little bit on the tissue that's in my other hand, or I have a piece of paper off to the side that I just dab it on there. Just by starting with not too much color. And then if I do feel like, oh, that's too much, then I can just get some plain water. Yeah. So a brush that's got plain water on it dilutes the color and blends it. But a dry brush, a brush that's almost dry, which I can do by putting it on that tissue, that picks up color. So, again, following the line of the petal, the direction. Everything on a flower goes from the outward to the center. The center is always where the stem hits the flower. And I like what's happening here because I like the additional contrast that the darker color is giving me. Another thing to remember is that watercolor always dries a little lighter than what you're putting down. It just does. And so if you want really rich color, you got to use lots more than you think sometimes. Not bad. I honestly started this video not knowing what would happen, so I guess it turned out okay. All right, looking good. I like it. I'm gonna maybe go back and do a little bit more touch up on the green, add a little bit more shadow. I'll do that as a time lapse, and then we'll see where we are. Okay, friends, so that's it. I hope you've enjoyed this. I will upload it to, I guess, Facebook or YouTube or something, and we'll see what people think. And if you think it's useful, let me know. Or if you think it's totally boring, let me know that too. I don't care. Not hurting my feelings. I really enjoy doing this. So thanks, and enjoy painting.